All right. Thanks for tuning in today. Today, our guest is Ben Killoy. He's a military veteran dad who started a podcast about being a military veteran dad, and he's got over 65 episodes live as of right now. But Ben, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to come on the show with us today.
Thank you for saying hello at a random conversation at Podfest,
For sure. Can you give us
where
a
life happens in random hellos.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, just the random interactions. Yeah, we actually met at Podfest, which is a podcast conference, second largest conference, uh, podcast conference in the world. And actually, Chris Krumitzos, who founded it, was one of the previous guests on the show.
Nice. Another person with a very good why influence story, I imagine.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy. So, can you give us a quick spiel about what your podcast and your brand is all about?
So my podcast, Military Veteran Dad, is about reconnecting dads with essentially their emotions or the objective and the understanding of what you can do with the role of fatherhood. So many military veteran dads, they come home physically from war, then battle, wherever it may be, come home, transition out to a veteran, but we come home physically, but we don't come home mentally. And when we don't come home mentally, we put these emotional barriers between us and our kids, our marriage, and those barriers prevent us from really growing. And if anything, they end up pushing us away. And as a veteran, we have a lot of storms going on inside. And those storms can essentially come to two conclusions. One, that your family's better off without you and end up killing yourself. Or two, you end up just self-destructing your own life and your marriage, your kids, everything goes bankrupt and you end up not being a part of your kid's life. And so it's my objective to help dads understand the role of a father, understand how they can shape their kid's life, get them excited for being a dad, understanding how they can be a provider, they can do other things than just providing a paycheck, that the emotional support, like there's so many studies out there that show that fatherhood is just as important as motherhood, and that fathers, like even just the craziest statistic that I always repeat is like 65% of mass shooters are from fatherless homes. So like the role that fathers have in just providing a balanced life for kids as they go into the world, like that, you can't underestimate that ability or that role and how much that actually can affect someone.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And when we met, you were talking about how you just recently went to a dad's influencer specific conference, right?
Yep. So it's essentially dad influencers trying to redefine fatherhood at all levels of the government, the society, the role we play, stay-at-home dads, essentially just creating a conversation in a place that didn't have any conversations whatsoever.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I wasn't aware of this whole, sub community. There's a lot of people out there who are, creating influence that are dads, and it's a supportive network. And it sounds like an amazing community.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely something that keeps getting richer and richer with each day and each episode, and I get more and more excited as each day goes forward.
All right. So, I'm sure that, the level of impact that the topic that you're talking about has, dramatic effects on some of other fathers that are out there. So do you mind sharing a story about someone that you've impacted in some way as a result of sharing on your podcast?
So there's two episodes that come to mind. One was actually the story from a wife's perspective where her husband did kill himself. And essentially that taught me an important lesson that suicide isn't something that actually terminates the pain. Suicide is something that just passes on the pain that you feel inside. And so you think that this is actually going to make your family's life better because you feel like you're a burden in their life. But all you do is create a scar on their heart that they never actually know how to heal from. And there's questions that scar never really has the answers for. And it creates this gap in their life that they never understand of why wasn't I good enough as a child for my dad to continue living? Like these questions haunt kids of parents that took their own life. And that essentially I have iTunes reviews saying that wives have introduced their husbands to that episode and their husband started seeing a therapist because that episode was there and it helped them wake up to the idea or the pain that they would create by not choosing to feel what they need to feel. And there's another episode that it was a simple episode about emotions. That was 20 minutes. I didn't think it was anything really game changing, but it was just some basic stuff, how to deal with your emotions. And I've received a 5-paragraph email from a Vietnam veteran and said that if someone would have told me this episode 30 years ago, that I would have been a better dad. That tell me about how to feel things, how to reconnect with their kids. Like the amount of people that respond and say like, what you just said is what I was thinking, but couldn't describe, happens probably at least 2 times a month. Someone will out there will say like, I feel like you just hacked my brain with what you said.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful stuff. I mean, like I've had a guest that he does graffiti art, and he posts his graffiti art on Instagram. So he's built an audience on Instagram, and he graffitis the terms love on the walls. And he said that he's had people, the second day when he's at a site, approach him and say, "Hey, I walked by last night, saw your artwork, and it actually, I was going to kill myself, and as a result, I decided not to because I saw your artwork." And he's literally saving people's lives by doing this artwork. And I have to believe that, if you have not already done that, I'm sure that it will be happening, as you continue your journey.
And part of podcasting is you change lives in a way like that mural. You never know who walks by that needed that mural that day. And you never really know. Sometimes people reach out, but a lot of times they don't, of people that were impacted. And I'll see different people posting things, and they'll share how an episode impacted them. Maybe even not in like a big way, but it was like the exact message they needed that day. And I was like, well, that was never what I intended that episode to be, but someone needed something out of that in a way that I wasn't even trying to curate. So once you start diving into these topics and realizing your ability to communicate these topics, it just gets that much stronger to be able to do it. And every time you talk and you're on the other side of these interviews, you yourself become a stronger voice. And that's one of probably the coolest parts of influencing this type of conversation or any topic that's heavy, is your voice on it gets stronger and stronger. And as your voice gets stronger, you become someone that's almost like a super weapon that can reach down and pull people up and help them in that time, almost at a rapid pace, because you've been training on in every interview. You get all these shortcuts, all this wisdom, and you can reflect life in so many different ways, and so many different ways for people to see. Like, even if you didn't live that life, like I've never been a military dad, actually. I've never had kids in the military, but I've interviewed a lot of military dads and how they've transitioned and how they show up. And that allows me to be able to bring all these different ideas to people that I show up and into in different parts of life.
That's huge. I really liked how you said your voice becomes a super weapon, and you can reach down and pick people up. That's really powerful.
Yeah, and actually, funny story where that came from. So my journey, I started probably, 4 years ago on this growth journey, and I started blogging first. And I was kind of in a dark time, and honestly, the blog post I would write, I was actually the first person that benefited from it, because I was like, oh, that's really good advice that I just wrote. I should take it myself. And one of them was a letter that I wrote to myself on why I was worth it. And it was some advice given to me, the writing a letter to myself on why I was worth it. So this is me typing a letter to myself, but from a context of like a close friend reminding me. And I'm typing along, and then all of a sudden I type, like, early in life, you think that people pushed you down, and all of these things, they being bullied and not being accepted or holding you back. Like, these things are a ceiling breaking you from doing what you want to do. And then all of a sudden I write to myself, but early in life, people pushed you down so that later in life you could pull people up. And I was like, whoa, where'd that come from? And it essentially gave me the idea, or the context, that by being pushed down and being at that view of life, I can see it on someone's face faster than most people. And now that as I've risen, I can reach down and pull people up because I was that person. I know what they're feeling. I know what they need in their life. And even friendships is something I talk about a lot, that friends is essentially the vehicle that's changed my life the most. And like at 30, my midlife crisis was dying alone. And so coming from at 30, dying alone and having no real friends in my life, to now where I'm abundantly with friends, friendships have been that one vehicle. So often what I offer the world is friendship. And I'm the friend I wish I had 5 years ago when I show up. Even the conversation you had, I always show up in the way that I wanted someone to show up in my life 5 years ago. And that's my mindset with every conversation. I'm always trying to lift people up because I never know where people are at. And I want to make sure that no one is there longer than they have to than where I was at.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's really powerful. And it was very apparent the first time we had a conversation and interaction that you're like that. So let's dive
Yeah.
into this a little bit. So you said you started blogging 4 years ago, and then uh, during your journey of blogging, at some point that evolved into, is that the podcast is the next step, or?
The podcasting was kind of always there, or the idea of a podcast. I had probably like 4 or 5 ideas, all different ideas. None of them really related to each other. And I had this idea of being a veteran dad life coach. And that was kind of the idea I was even blogging about, but I didn't really believe it. And that's part of the problem when you start an online business is all you touch is electrons. You're not actually touching any emotional energy that your body can feel or interact with. And so it's hard sometimes to feel that it's real. And that was the case for me. So 2 weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, I went to a dad influencer conference. The one that did it for me was I went to a military influencer conference, and that's actually the name of it. And I went there, and it was kind of like this out of body experience. Like there was this online version for 2 years of Killoy, and he had merged with a physical Ben Killoy, which never really, they could always coexist. They never had to be each other. And like, are people going to think I'm the same person as in person as I am online? And I didn't explode. I didn't die. I dove into it and merged those two personalities and became the same person. And as I started talking about this, there was a military spouse that I was telling my story and what I wanted to do. And I brought her to tears. And when I realized that because her husband came home, but never really came home, he just kind of is on autopilot. And that real emotion, that real feeling that I physically saw something that I said invoke an emotion in someone that I was having a conversation, and not by intention, but just the way that I said it. And I wasn't even trying to invoke or anything sadness. That struck me inside that this is my why influence, because I was able to invoke that emotion. And that was like, okay, this is my purpose. This is my passion. If I was able to do that and I can help other dads prevent that from happening, I need to do this. And so that was September of 2018. On the plane ride home from Orlando, I wrote my business plan. I came up with the mission to bring every dad home. And for the next 3 months, I spent launching my podcast. And then on January 1st of 2019, we launched. So it took one conversation and one raw feeling. And then that was the validation I needed. And that's when I started running.
Okay. So you started your blog to potentially become like a military dad coach. But then
and I would say I started with that idea and that topic, but as I reflect back, because I wasn't really niched or honed in my energy and my focus, I was just really going to the gym and working a lot of random muscles without the clear intent of what they were all for. And so like writing, well, anything you really do on the internet, you need to learn how to write. So while I didn't have a very clear, concise topic that I could produce a product from, learning how to write consistently in a blog and converting your head thoughts to emotions and words, that's a good muscle to have exercise. So all of that was kind of just like putting in the reps for something that I didn't fully understand what it was going to be.
Okay. And that probably opened you up too for being more vulnerable. You had this like warm up of doing everything through text.
The muscles were almost exercised already. And even now, like I don't even really realize that I'm vulnerable when I'm vulnerable until someone like starts crying or something and I say something and I trigger something. And I'm like, I don't even really realize it when it's on because it's almost a natural part of my being. But it was part of that even before I had a podcast. Like I was already creating friends. I was already creating a network. I was already creating people that wanted to see me succeed. And then once I started doing things, then all of those people were there. I had that emotional connection with them. And then it just started happening. But it all kind of happened just because I kept putting in the reps. And a lot of, even if you're listening to this and you don't know your true why influence, but you have a few breadcrumbs, that your breadcrumbs and your curiosity, they go hand in hand. Like those are the breadcrumbs of your passion. So me writing on veterans in my own life allowed me to find that one thing that allowed me to go. And as I look back, even some of the best advice that I even use in my podcast is I use my own self as my avatar. So I created a product that I would have wanted in my life 5 years ago. And so my avatar, I have like 4 or 5 paragraphs written out for him. His name is Daniel. And the inside joke is my middle name is Daniel. So it's actually the avatar of who I was 5 years ago. And I know exactly what I needed 5 years ago. So when you're trying to figure out what your why influence is, the best story that you can bring to the world is yours, and you're overcoming it and then helping other people that were at that same point overcome it. Like there's so much energy and passion that can come from that because you were continuing to live that life that you started, and people want to know what you did to overcome that. And that energy almost comes naturally, and you're not trying to create something or figure out something or get stuck. That the energy flows a lot easier if you almost focus your story outward from your influence on your own story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I like that you use an avatar with your middle name as your previous self, and that I feel very aligned to that because that's similar to what I've done. I mean, I struggle to share or even find a reason to share. I didn't care that I wasn't sharing anything, to like growing to care than to feeling obligated to
It's so
I've got
more
the
important to
podcast.
start.
Right. And even and
Just
how you
start
talk
doing
about
something.
your blog is like how I feel like this podcast is for me, because I already feel like it's evolving and it's becoming something, something else is going to come as a result of it. And I don't really know exactly what it is, but I sort of feel like I'm getting closer to it. And I think I resonate a lot with your story. It's great.
And this podcast is a good example of is just the basic idea. If you don't fully understand something, but you know that's where you need to head, interviewing people in that space ultimately creates you stronger. Like even if nobody ever listens to this or does anything with the content, you yourself as a vehicle of listening to these conversations are stronger, more educated, more resilient, and more clear on what you want to do with your life. There was on the way home from that dad conference, I was on the airplane. There was a bunch of college kids in suits, and I was like, one of them sat next to me. So I asked him, "What are you in a suit for?" And he's like, "Oh, we were at CPAC." And I was like, "Okay." And so then I was asking him what he was doing. He was coming back to Milwaukee. He was a surgeon. And by the end of the conversation, I was like, "Dude, you need a podcast and interview surgeons at the end of their career to help understand what mistakes they made, what lessons they learned, what things they realized they weren't expecting." Because you, as a person interviewing these surgeons, will grow and shortcut your career exponentially. And then at the same time, as many surgeons over a 15-year journey to try to become one will then understand the road, whether they really want it. They don't have to go down this road and figure out 10 years into it, this isn't really what I want. Like you could use a podcast to figure out what it is you want to do, or make sure that's what you want to do, or even just be better at it. So I love podcasting from the idea of what you're doing, of just exploring a space to understand exactly what that space looks like.
Yeah, that's huge. And doing a podcast definitely opens doors. I mean, before my podcast was even live, I had gotten a interview with a YouTuber with over 1 million subscribers just by saying I've got a podcast, and then they
It's
never
like a
asked for a link
lamppost.
to
Like
it.
you just stick it in the ground and say, "I'm here," and then people find you.
Right.
And everybody wants to have a conversation. So you can get a lot of cool guests just by saying, "Hey, I got a podcast. Want to come on and have a conversation?" They won't charge you, and you get to interview a lot of elite people that there's not a lot of other vehicles that you can do that with.
For sure. So let's dive into your why for the podcast. You talked about how you went to a conference, you were able to touch someone there, you made a business plan and started the podcast. But what's the driving factor for the podcast for you?
I would say the driving factor is being able to use what I often would felt in the early days felt like as a burden. Like I'm a very emotional guy. I feel things very heavily. I'll cry at happy endings. I'll cry very heavily at sad endings. And I always felt like that was kind of this burden that I just got stuck in my own soup of emotions. And so for my drive is to try to take that soup and try to grow flowers out of it and create something that actually can help other people. So my why is still continuing to figure out how I can hone my own issues and emotions, but then figure out how to sharpen them in a way that actually bring them. So I continue to grow on this journey because as I grow and do things like talking live on a Facebook podcast, that all of those things continue to get me to grow and sharpen my skills. But at the same time, I connect with a dad who feels what he needs to feel, or I get one of those emails that I helped change a dad's life. And like my why in the beginning was probably just to help other dads. Like that's really what I wanted to do. But by now at the end, my why is simply, I never want a kid to never grow up without his father's love. And there's something that I've, through the course of interviewing, that the biggest takeaway for me is legacy. And that our family is our legacy. And many veterans they get hung up on these questions from our service and figuring out how to recraft their life in the form of legacy. And like your kids are the best chance you have to make a mark on this world. And whatever you teach them and instill in them, they will go out and continue to change the world in those key ways. And as a military dad, veterans make up 7% of the population. We have a very unique view of the world. We have a lot of life experience in a short amount of time. And if we can gift that to our kids can help go out into the world and change it if they understand who they are. And so I just like the idea of connecting dads with their kids, getting them excited about that purpose. And there's one thing that I often gift a lot of dads. They get hung up on. They'll hung up on a question of like, why did my friend die and I lived? Like, I don't deserve to live. He deserves to live. That question haunts a lot of veterans, especially the ones that did time in Iraq and Afghanistan. But essentially, the way you frame that is your defining moment is when he died and you got to live, because he gave you a gift to go home and hug your kids. And if he was a dad, he no longer gets to hug his kids, and his kids no longer get to feel their love. So you need to be able to define your life in a way that you always rise to that gift and the quality and challenge that you need to be worthy of that gift as well. So getting dads excited about this, getting them invigorated to be dads, all of that just fuels me. And being a dad myself, my kids are 7, 5, and 3. So I'm right in the thick of this experiment as well called fatherhood, and getting excited and learning about me being a better dad, helping others become a better dad. Those two things are kind of like these magic synergies that come together. And it's where my energy comes up. It's where I get excited. Talking fatherhood is something that I can do forever. And it comes from a natural place because that's the season I'm in right now. I want to be dad more than anything right now.
Wow, that's amazing. So you started your podcast to help other dads, and then it's grown to now helping with this connection between the fathers and their children, and making that bond stronger and having reasons to make that stronger. So why is that so important to you? Like, why is it so important for these other dads to have this strong connection with their kids?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I ever dove into it. I think if I were to pick that strong why, I think that it's the feeling. So growing up, I was alone. I felt alone. I didn't have friends. And that feeling of alone is something military veterans, dad, have a lot. And so for my strong why is I know what that feeling is inside. And if I can gift the gift of friendship through a conversation or connection to someone else to cancel out a little bit of that feeling, that helps me know that the pain, I've helped someone else relieve the pain that they couldn't feel. And that's actually something that I usually get quite a bit when I learn how to craft my words and things, that I'll put words to things that others didn't know how to explain. And a good example of this, which I didn't consider a very vulnerable moment, but I was at a dad summit and I was telling my story about friendship and that I didn't have a lot of friends in my life and that I had to overcome this, and I did, and what I did to overcome it. And at the end, I got up and we were conversation, and a dad came up to me, didn't even get to hello, and he just started crying. And essentially, I put words to a feeling that he wasn't acknowledging or really didn't even know how to describe, but he knew something was there. And all he could do was cry because it just created this overwhelming connection to that feeling. And once I realized that that's what I can do, it just gets me that much more excited to help people connect to their feelings. Because being a feelings person, I'm not scared of them, but a lot of men are scared of them. So that just helping people feel what they need to feel, that often is a lot of my why, because I wasn't that person feeling what I needed to feel. And I was feeling very alone and just scared. And now as I enter my purpose, helping other people understand that same thing and ignite that, that's something that I get really excited about.
Yeah, I mean, all these stories that you share are so powerful. So when you said that your deep why is so that you feel like you grew up sort of feeling alone, and you didn't want to have others have that pain as well. And so by giving this parent-child bonds to be much stronger, you're avoiding this pain that could be there as a result. And why is it?
And if you create that family connection, you can, like Steve Jobs used to say, like he really wanted to make a dent in the universe, and I would say he did. But as a father, what I've really realized is, like, in a military veteran, you think your effectiveness is limited to the range of your rifle, but in reality, as a father, if you reframe it, your effectiveness is essentially generational. So if you can create a family cohesiveness with a strong marriage that provides a good example for your kids to go into the world, that provides a strong connection to your daughter, even just something like hugging your daughter over the age of growing up reduces the chance she'll have sex by the age of 12 by 75%. And like just something as simple as that, you can create a real change in a child's life as she becomes an adult and she becomes a woman. And as a son grows into a man, you have such an ability to affect generational change that so many of our issues in society root back to fathers not being even a part of their kid's relationship as growing up, or even the acknowledgement from the court system that fathers need to be part of their kid's life, like just with the stroke of a pen, 100% custody to moms for no other reason because they think that's what's best. Like that, when I've realized what fathers are capable of doing and affecting change in their kid's life in all the ways, their marriage, their every aspect, like that just gets me so much more excited, because I described that Steve Jobs quote as, if you think of the universe as a wall, our job or our ability or the opportunity that we have to do something is you can make a dent in that wall. So when someone walked by the wall of the universe, they're going to be like, the Killoys were here, because that dent's going to be so big. No, people are going to notice that, like, wow, the Killoys went out into the world and changed it, and this is the dent that they left. And as a dad, you can really create an amazing kid that goes out into the world to do amazing things. And when you start thinking about this generational change, everything that we're going through right now with coronavirus and anything else of a societal problem, you have an ability as a father to affect that change right there in your kids. And that can be the vehicle that goes out in the world and changes it. And you don't know how it's going to work out, but just that ability to understand that they can do that potential, that just gets me super excited.
Yeah, as it should. It's pretty exciting. So when you started your podcast, did you have any barriers to overcome when starting it? And if so, can you share some, like, one of your bigger barriers and maybe how you powered through it?
So I would say that they were probably the very common one. So this entire time, I had a very limiting belief that I was a person of value. Even the letter I wrote to myself, why I was worth it. So the idea that I could create a podcast and I could be a voice, and that my voice actually had currency in the open market that people would understand and value, was a hard limiting belief that I had to overcome. But once that why was ignited, I just kind of turned that limiting belief off, because I knew I needed to do this. And I knew that I could do that because I physically evoked that emotion in that woman. So that kind of limiting belief that my voice didn't matter was kind of canceled out in that moment. But just the idea that even when you first start, you think like all these, like you're comparing yourself to professional podcasters and all these different things. Like the hardest part of starting a podcast is thinking it needs to be perfect on day one. And I often tell people the hardest part is starting. Once you start, you're not going to fail unless you quit, because as long as you keep publishing, you'll keep growing. And as long as you keep growing, you'll become more successful. But you need to just get through that suck phase. Like that first 6 months, you're going to suck. And the faster you can start sucking and get through that sucking phase, you'll be better on the other side of all of that to be a better podcaster. So that natural idea that I wasn't worthy enough to be a voice was there, but I overcame it just by connecting with a really strong why and knowing that I needed to do this and figure out what was on the other side. And even the mindset that I've used still to this day is the more something scares me, the more something I believe is on the other side of that fear. So as long as it's not the coronavirus or something that's actually going to kill me, I believe that if something is truly scaring me aside, that's just my brain trying to keep me safe. And what's really on the other side of that fear is something beautiful. So this scared the hell out of me. And with that mindset, I started my fear and started running through that fear. And on the other side was this podcast and my voice. And it's became something that even I didn't fully understand what it was when I first started. It was kind of just this side project, this side hustle. But as you grow your voice, you realize it resonates, you get better at it. You realize you're changing lives. It just gets easier to fuel your excitement and your passion. So that first limiting belief was just overcoming that my voice was something worthy. Or even if you like the sound of your voice, you're like, oh, I don't have a voice for podcasting. I've actually had a listener send me an email that said, my voice sounds like audio chocolate. And I'm like, I don't think my voice sounds like audio chocolate at all. But you just don't like your own voice because you're used to hearing it all the time. So like even that crappy limiting belief, like someone sends me an email that I'm audio chocolate, like, well, that just canceled out that my voice isn't anything good. Or even I've been told like, oh, I have a radio voice. I'm like, I've never thought I have a radio voice.
Yeah.
But that's just my limiting belief because you've never done it.
Yeah. I mean, I never thought much of it. And then people said like, hey, you got a radio voice. And it's like, I think it's just the microphone, that makes it happen. I don't know. But
it could be that. It's part of that. And I think it's just the energy and confidence that you start to grow with your voice, that you don't have it on day one, but it grows and it gets stronger. And that almost in itself makes a radio voice, is when you have confidence in what you're saying.
Yeah, good point. So I know we talked a little bit about it, but I like to ask because I've got requests to ask this. But what are your streams of income for the related to the podcast? And if there's nothing, maybe what's something that you foresee as possibilities or things that you're thinking about?
So right now the podcast isn't monetized, but that the podcast, there's many vehicles, sponsorships, there's products that you sell. And part of the journey for me podcasting is I wasn't fully clear on where the end result was. I just knew this podcast was a vehicle for my growth. So there's still probably a limiting belief that I'm working through of that there's something that people were willing to pay me for on the other side of this. So it's one thing to start a podcast, but then it's a different thing to realize that people are going to trade money for access to you for your podcast. And like that in itself, like even just getting your first sponsorship, that's a big growth exercise that you have something of value. And there's just so much hype wrapped up in this standard 8 to 5 job that you don't actually feel like you can create anything that compares to it, like of a value of like a brick and mortar business. That those are some of the limiting beliefs that I'm still facing. So right now the podcast isn't generating revenue, but as I look forward to going forward, I'm trying to take my voice that I've created and crafted the message around and take it more to a keynote type audience, or try to take it to a larger impact and in-person stuff. That kind of got blown up with the coronavirus stuff going on. So I'm kind of pivoting and trying to figure out other ways that I can connect and add value, either through coaching or maybe a program, or even if it's something like a workshop. So, but again, as long as I keep podcasting and keep growing, I'll keep getting clearer on what that is. And so if you're listening to this and you don't have any revenue streams like me, don't necessarily get like super frustrated, because sometimes it'll just come to you. And if it's not ready, it's not there. And be okay with that, and know that podcasting isn't a perfect science, and each conversation adds depth to your view on the podcast that you have. And maybe you just haven't had the right connection yet. Maybe you haven't had the right spark, and all it takes is one spark for you to have an idea that grows into something that then becomes profitable. Or someone comes into your life and says, "Hey, I've got an idea for you I'd like to invest in with you." So don't get super upset that you guys don't always have a revenue stream, because sometimes the best part of podcasting is part of the growth. And sometimes you just need to keep growing and it'll trust the process and it'll happen.
Yeah. And this whole time you're building a platform. I mean, I'm very similar to you in all of this. I mean, I have no current revenue streams with the podcast, nor any plans for anything. I've got, a business on the side that, I can pay the bills with. So the podcast is more of a passion project, but I just have faith that, something will come from it. And I feel like that's a similar approach that you're doing as well.
Yep.
So I know you've already given a ton of advice, but if anything else comes to mind, basically, do you have any advice for someone who is looking to start a podcast or is just starting out? Maybe, what major pieces of advice that you wish that you had starting out?
I would say it's 10 times more important to get started than worrying about starting. So it's important to have a logo. It's important to worry about branding. It's important to worry about your name, but it's not more important than 3 days of worrying about it. So if you find that you've been thinking about a podcast and you've been working on the name of it for 3 months, you just need to pick the best one on the table and run and watch, because you can change the name of a podcast once you start, but you can't duplicate the time you've lost by not interviewing people or doing what you did or putting your voice out. And like that exercise of publishing is 10 times more valuable than making sure you have the right name. So I think even at Podfest, there's so many people that just get stuck on what that podcast is and trying to get it perfect. And they're just excuses that become like almost like a teddy bear for their comfort zone to hold. And as long as it's nice and warm, that it's safe. And this excuse they just hold on to because it keeps them there. Those excuses are the ones you need to blow up and get through and get published, because you need to get through that suck. And the faster you can start, the faster you can get through that suck. And ideas will come to you. Like Legacy, that wasn't something I figured out till like episode 20. I didn't even have that on my radar. Now I have it as part of my logo, that our family is our legacy. So it's so much more important to start than to get it 100%. Like 75% is generally the number you want to get to, of like 75% of where you want it, and then just go. And a part of other thing that people get hung up on podcasting is they get stuck on these questions and then they try to not do anything because they don't have an answer. podcasting, there's 750,000 in the English language. Most likely someone has the lesson already learned and answered. You just need to know someone. So keep networking in a way that allows you to know someone that can help solve. Like, don't try to start a podcast on your own, because you could launch a podcast in as little as a week if you have the right network, because there's so many different people that can help you and shortcut different processes. And even at Podfest, I probably gifted 10 podcasts to people that they had this itch on their heart, and it was just still an itch. And I, within conversation, even like helping you randomly, I came up with a name for them. I came up with some things to get started. I told them how their format could go. I gave them some different things, and I tried to remove as many barriers that they could come up with as possible, because so many podcasts just die in the vine because they can't get through the muck of their own questions or excuses. And I try to knock as many out, because it's literally transformed my life. And I know a question you're going to lead up to here is, how has it helped me, or what unexpected way? And for me, it essentially saved my life, because 5 weeks ago, I was told, I went in January 27th to work like a normal day. And by 9 a.m., I was told my position was eliminated. And so through podcasting, I had already stretched the muscles and gained strength in an area that allowed me to persevere. So in a moment that could have destroyed me, and I could have been the normal destructive person that just says, I'm just a failure, I'm going to go through the 4 weeks of moping, I was already charged. I already had a network. I already had friends I could lean with. And almost instinctively after that, I started talking to people right on the phone. I just had as many conversations as I could that week. That helped me get through whatever I was going through. I learned that from podcasting, that when you have a conversation with someone, it just feels better. Like, you feel lighter. You feel literally, your physical mass hasn't changed, but emotionally you feel lighter. That came from podcasting. So in my ways, like, it literally paired me for a moment that without that podcast, I would have been hopeless and I would have been miserable. But essentially, by putting in the reps for that whole year, I have something now to keep running on. And hopefully I never have to go back to get a job. Like, I want this to grow into something that allows me to create a life that I can only see when I close my eyes.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, definitely just get started, obviously, and then find the right people in your network. And if you need help with that, I'm sure both of us, I'm sure anybody can reach out to you, and anyone can reach out to me, trying to get some advice or some direction with what they're trying to do with their voice. But just get started and, find the people that you need to, or just start a podcast on how to podcast, and you'll just, get a couple of interviews with people before you're even live, and then you use that to start your podcast or something. There's a lot of different strategies.
The entrepreneur one is the most famous example that I use this with. Like, if you don't know, if you're not clear about something, like entrepreneurship, I want to be an entrepreneur, but I have no idea what, don't have no idea how. Well, there are probably 2,000 entrepreneurship podcasts out there. It doesn't really matter. Entrepreneurs will come talk to you. That's not going to be the problem. So just start an interview show with entrepreneurs for your own benefit, selfishly, and then share it. And maybe if 20 people help, that's fine. But you grow exponentially every time you interview an entrepreneur, because you get clearer and clearer on what it is your entrepreneur life looks like. That's the best way to grow. So don't get hung up on, I don't have a podcast exactly focused on military veteran dads. If you're not clear, start a dad podcast. It doesn't really matter. The more you talk, the more you get clear. And that's the biggest part of all of this. And even Podfest, when you talk to random people, there's a lot of magic that happens in between two conversations. Like, I'm going from the person that didn't have any friends, which was ultimately because I was afraid to talk to people, to now I'm almost addicted to talking to strangers. And now my mindset is I'm always one conversation away from something amazing, and I'll miss 100% of those chances I don't take. So I talk to almost everybody, even if it doesn't seem like it has any idea or any connection or any which way to feel like it's going to matter. I always try to take it, because it's that random conversation that completely blows your mind. And you're like, we should have been friends 5 years ago. And you have to just keep talking. And so any exercise and the ability to have conversations is a good one, especially if you're an introvert. This is a good exercise in just getting outside that comfort zone. And even the military, like the military sends you through these 3-day courses of how to be a civilian. I would have found more value if they took me to a sales summit and told me to sell pots and pans to someone in this room over and over, and get used to that conversation, get used to hearing no. That would have served me more in life than learning how to write a resume, like learning how to talk to people, getting rejected, learning how to explore ideas. That would have been a far better lesson that would have proved dividends a lot earlier than 15 years later after transitioning out. that I would have been a lot header in life as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, knowing that, a lot of the listeners here are either struggling to share or in their beginning or early stages of their sharing journey, before I open the floor for you to talk a little bit more about your brand, which I'll be putting links to everything on the show notes for this episode, do you have any last words for our listeners?
That the one thing that I find with everybody that has listened to a podcast or a YA influence is you might have heard about your voice and finding it. Podcasting is the best vehicle to find your voice. And once you find it, it's almost instinctively becomes part of your DNA to keep giving it. And as I've connected with more dads, as I understand my voice, that voice is something the world needs to hear. And if you're holding on to a story that's super powerful, maybe even super vulnerable, you need to share it, because there's a lesson in vulnerability that the world thinks that you'll explode almost when you're vulnerable. Like that's the basic construct of American society, I think. But man, the opposite happens when you share something vulnerable. You actually become a magnet for people around you, that people are almost like, wow, that really hit me hard because I can relate to X and X and X. But there's this Facebook effect of like, oh, everybody's life doesn't have these problems. But when you're vulnerable, magic stuff happens. And there's this saying that I repeat, that the world is waiting for you to go first. So that way someone else has permission to go second. And if you go first, you can inspire someone to go second. And that is so powerful, because they'll take a step in their life that they currently are too afraid of. But you need to demonstrate that power of your own voice to give them that gift to go second, because you need to inspire that action, give them that words, and give them that courage by you being vulnerable. And when you do that, in my case, I can save an entire family from losing their father. Like that's the power of me being vulnerable. That's exercised routinely throughout having a podcast. And if you can get that honed in and strong enough, man, you can just multiply the effect of how many people get permission to go second and get more and more change in the world in the topic that you pick. And that's podcasting to me is how you change the world, because it's the micro conversations that no one's willing to have. And if you find a conversation worth sharing, find it, share it, because that conversation needs to happen, and it'll slowly be how we start to bring the world back together.
Well, Ben, that was awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to put links to all your social medias and everything on the show notes for this episode at whyinfluence.com. But what's the best way for people to get a hold of you, or where do you prefer people consume what you're putting out there? Give us a little bit of direction for that.
I would say Instagram. Instagram is something very interesting for me, but I'm leaning into it, especially after these conferences. I've gotten more connected to it. So Instagram, my Instagram is at Ben_Killoy. There's also, if you want to follow the podcast, at Military Veteran Dad. And then the other way to get contacted me is militaryveterandad.com is my website. That's the best way to stay in touch. I just released the new time management ebook on there, so you can subscribe to the newsletter and get that content. But honestly, what I offer, and if anybody needs it, if anything resonated, whether it be a podcast idea or any connection, friendship is the one product I offer free. And my phone number is literally right on my website. You can text me, you can call me. I don't hide. You can schedule time with me right on my website, because that human connection is what's going to change the world, not the internet. So I offer it freely. So if anything resonated, you need to help on your podcast, whatever it may be, reach out, because I'm more than willing to have that conversation, because that's what I would have needed 5 years ago in my life.
Well, Ben, thanks so much for coming on here today and sharing your why and being vulnerable with us. Before I let you go, I do like to try to ask for some feedback as far as this podcast goes in my journey. So I'm just wondering, do you have any feedback as regards to being a guest on the show, your experience overall, anything?
No, I think you've got a nice niche here, because you are providing a microphone to exploratory surgery, almost, of people trying to explore the muck that is kind of their curiosity sometimes. And so you could maybe use the idea of, like, in order to find your passion, you follow your curiosity. That could be a good question to lead into. Like, what are you currently curious about in your own life? Because a lot of times people aren't even thinking about what they're curious about. So curiosity are those breadcrumbs that leads you to your passion. And the hardest part about what you're providing here is when you ask someone what their passion is, you probably get 75% of people have never even thought of the question. Maybe it's a little bit higher. I'm kind of just randomly making up that statistic. But that statistic and that idea, that question, it almost becomes a curse question. I remember the first time someone was asking me, I'm like, I don't really know what my passion is. What do I Does that mean I'm alive if I don't have a passion? Am I dead? And it just kind of haunted me with this question. It just looped in my head, and I'm an overthinker, so this question just ran on autopilot. But then I was on another podcast or listening to another podcast, and this guy, Dan Miller, was talking about skip your passion, just focus on your curiosity. As long as you follow your curiosity, you'll find your passion. And that proved perfect. I followed my curiosity within veterans and started doing different things in it. I started exploring my curiosity. I published a book on Amazon out of curiosity, not to sell it, but to understand the process. And all of those things led me to where I am today. And so maybe guiding that curiosity journey could be something you incorporate in your interviews, because that's where it started for me. And it was those breadcrumbs that I started following that got me to my why influence today. It's not something you wake up to one day. Even something as random as the veteran idea, I started with just a regular life coach idea. And I was reading a stupid Tom Clancy novel, and there was a Marine at Arlington Cemetery over a grave. And in that moment, I realized that I could be a guy helping veterans. That was the moment. Reading a book written by Tom Clancy. It was a fiction book, nothing real. That moment was one pivot point that got me closer to where I am today. So like that was just like, it's crazy how sometimes that process worked. But that curiosity is essentially what keeps feeding the machine to get you to your true why influence.
Awesome. Well, that's great feedback. I'll definitely take a look at getting that incorporated in. I appreciate that for sure.
And I appreciate you having me on and saying hello, because this is just another example of what can come from saying hello. We had this nice conversation at PodFest. Now it's growing into an interview, and now it's going to be replicated into the internet for the archives of time. And you never know what's going to come from us having this conversation, but it all started in a very loud conversation of karaoke, of trying to talk to each other. And that hello can spark. And like, if this interview helps someone, that wouldn't have happened unless the first domino fell me saying hello.
Right. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Well, Ben, thanks again for coming on. If you're listening, you can see this right now. It's live on YouTube because we recorded it live. And then otherwise, we'll have a page on the website in the next week or so that has it live on the podcast with all of the links to your website, your social medias, and the show notes for the episode. So,
well, I'm excited to hear anybody out there that has any feedback, or anybody that got excited, or what someone creates out of listening to this conversation.
Yeah, definitely reach out to Ben if you got some value out of his